Hello, welcome back to In the Kitchen with the Dietitian. This is Jane's story. This is my long-awaited first episode in my series on whole grains. It is corn. Corn is the only whole grain that is also a vegetable. How do we determine if it's a whole grain or a vegetable? Well, it depends on when it's harvested. If it's harvested when it's fully mature and dry, then it's considered a whole grain. If it's harvested when there's still fluid in the kernel, then it's considered a vegetable. Corn is one of the many whole grains that is naturally gluten-free, and it contains 10 times more vitamin A than any other whole grain. It also offers fiber, phosphorus, magnesium, manganese, selenium, and thiamine. As I've said before, it is important to vary your whole grains. Each one of them is different in its nutrient composition, so we need to make sure that we're exposing ourselves to a variety. Whole grains can be difficult to identify when we're shopping in the store. There is a lot of terminology. In my introduction to whole grains, I kind of alluded to what is considered a whole grain. That means it has its bran, its endosperm, and its germ still intact. So when we're shopping for whole grain corn, if it says it's been degerminated or enriched, it's not a whole grain. Degerminated means the germ has been taken away. One way to tell if a whole grain is actually a whole grain is by the stamp. And I've shown you this before. This product right here contains the stamp from the Whole Grain Council, but not all products contain that. Like this package of grits I have here. It came directly from the mill being ground up, but it does not have a stamp on it. It still is a whole grain. So we're going to kind of go through the terminology that can be found on the packaging. The USDA, who puts out the dietary guidelines every 5 years, is a little bit more lenient on what they consider to be a whole grain versus the Whole Grain Council, which puts out the stamp. So some of the terms that the USDA allows is something that's nixtamalized. Nixtamalized cornmeal and corn flour, hominy grits, whole grain corn, ground corn treated with lime, masa harina, corn masa, whole grain cornmeal. Nixtamalization, big word, is a way that corn is processed that adds calcium to the end product and frees up some of the B vitamins. Wet nixtamalization is the most common, and that is where it's soaked in a lime solution. Then it's rinsed thoroughly and drained. It can be used immediately after this to make tortillas, tortilla chips, and other foods, or it can be dried into masa flour. Since some bran can be lost in this process, the Whole Grain Council doesn't necessarily consider it a whole grain, but the USDA does. Hominy is an example of this nixtamalization process, and I have some right here. It swells it up really big. There's many types of corn grown across the world. Sweet corn makes up about 1% of the corn. It is harvested when there's still fluid in the kernel, so that's when it's a vegetable. Field or dent corn is the most common and is seen in the great abundance in the Midwest. It is not harvested until dry, and at that time it has a dent in it, so that's why they call it dent corn. It's used to make grits and cornmeal, but more importantly, it's used for animal feed and ethanol production. There is also flint corn, and it has a hard outer shell. It's used as popping corn, like I have here, and it can be colorful, red, blue, yellow, dark brown, and it can be used for decorating like we do in the fall. So I'm going to kind of go through the products that I have here on my counter. These are actually whole grain products. They haven't been made into anything yet. So something has to happen to these grains for it to be edible. We have to add some water to it. We have to add some water and some heat to it or something. It's really hard to find grits that are whole grain. Bob's Red Mill is one that you can readily find at a lot of places. Kroger tends to carry it. H-E-B does here in Texas. Walmart does some of the locations. It's called polenta, but basically that's just a fancy name for grits. I also have some grits that are from a mill. This mill was in South Carolina. I'll provide a link to it at the end of my video, just so in case you are interested in buying it. The shipping and handling on it was cheap, but it seems like it took forever to get. These are coarse yellow grits. These are coarse white grits, and these are coarse blue grits. So depending on what you're wanting the meal to look like, you can pick your color. These are also blue grits. I got these from a mill here in Texas, in Austin, and I will also provide you with a link to that. They are not compensating me in any way. I have cornmeal. I have coarse ground cornmeal. I have medium grind cornmeal. And then I have whole grain corn flour. I also have masa flour to make tortillas. I have yellow and I have white and then I have blue. And we are gonna make some tortillas, not in this video. I decided I'm gonna break it up into segments to kind of keep it more manageable for people. I know lots of people don't like to watch lengthy videos. So the other thing I have is whole kernel corn. As I showed you, the popcorn, we're gonna heat it up in an air popper. The first thing that I'm gonna cook in this first episode is going to be cornbread. We're gonna get started making our cornbread muffins. The recipe I'm using came from the Whole Grain Council and Bob's Red Mill website. I will give you a link to it, and I will also provide you with my recipe. I have made some changes and I have made some additions. Actually, I've made one addition and then I made a couple changes. I wanted to show you what I'm gonna cook it in. I have these silicone molds that are corn, and I'm gonna use those, but I'm also gonna use one of these glass ones. I have a glass mold too, because I wanna make these a little bit smaller than I have in the past. I've made this recipe several times, and so I think I've got it tweaked just right. And I also wanted to show you other options. I have a cast iron one here, and then I have an aluminum one here that's got a pattern on it. I'm gonna put the camera overhead so you can see what I'm doing. I got my bowls here. I got a big bowl and a smaller bowl for my wet ingredients and a big bowl for my dry ingredients. I'm gonna start with the pastry flour. So the recipe called for whole grain flour or whole wheat pastry flour. So I'm using whole wheat pastry flour because it's got a little bit finer texture to it. And then I'm using the medium grind cornmeal. The whole wheat flour I used was 1 cup, but I weighed it. It was 120 grams. When we're baking, we need to weigh so we can have some accuracy in it. The medium grind whole grain cornmeal I'm using is 228 grams. And then I have a tablespoon of baking soda and a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. I don't typically add salt to my things, but this recipe is pretty basic, and I think we need the salt to bring out some of the flavor. And then I'm just gonna go ahead and whisk this all up. And I'll set that aside. And then we will get to our wet ingredients. I have some melted butter. I have a 1/4 cup here. I substituted out the oil and used a 1/4 cup of the Country Crock Original. It's got the least amount of ingredients and nothing artificial. And it's got 50 calories and 5 grams of fat versus 120 calories and about 14 with oil. So that was why I substituted that out. And then I'm using a cup of milk, but I'm using the ultra filtered milk so that I can add a little bit extra protein to this. And I have a cup of that. I have a 1/2 cup of unsweetened applesauce. This is an addition in the recipe. I didn't feel like the recipe was moist enough, so I added that, and I also added that to add a little bit of sweetness. The original recipe called for 2 tablespoons of evaporated cane juice, which I first of all don't have, and second of all is still sugar. I'm using this light agave that's sweetened with monk fruit and stevia. And so it's a liquid, so I'm just switching a liquid for a liquid. But I'm actually going to add 4 tablespoons versus 2 in the recipe, just for that little bit more sweetness as in this recipe. I'm just kind of gonna mix that together before I add my egg. I'm gonna beat my egg before I put it in there. Okay, and I just noticed that the recipe called for a half teaspoon of salt, and I only used a 1/4 teaspoon. All right, so here's my extra 1/4 teaspoon of salt. I'll go ahead and put that in the dry ingredients. All right, then we're gonna move this over, and then we're just going to pour our wet ingredients in here. And you could add any seasoning you wanted. If you wanted to kind of add a Southwest flair to it, you could add some chili powder or chili flakes. We don't want to over mix it, but we do want to make sure we get it mixed up. And just so you can kind of see the consistency of my batter. I am going to weigh this. You do not have to do this, but I am going to because I want to make sure that I evenly distribute it. I have about 807 grams of batter divided by 18 servings. And so each one of them is going to have about 45 grams of batter in it. My big boy out here. I'm also going to spray this down with some cooking spray, maybe. There we go. They do pop out, but just to be on the safe side. Okay, so one full scoop is roughly 45 grams. I have them all pretty much evenly distributed here, as you can see. I'm gonna go ahead and stick them in the oven. They're out of the oven now. It took less than 20 minutes because my batter wasn't in the pan as far. I have 12 of the really good ones out of the silicone pan. Those just pop right out. And then I have the ones out of the glass pan, which did not pop out so great. I probably could have sprayed them a little bit better, but I really prefer the silicone one because they just fall out. The breakdown for these, it is 1.2 ounce equivalents of whole grain because I used the cornmeal and the whole wheat pastry flour, so all the grain in it was whole grain. It is 95 calories, 2 grams from fat. The saturated ended up being 0, even though there was some saturated fat in the butter, but because I broke it up into 18 servings, it's less than 1. 16 grams of carbohydrates, 2 grams of fiber, 0 grams of added sugar, 3 grams of protein, and 242 milligrams of sodium. The majority of the sodium came from the baking soda and the salt I added, but it really has good flavors. These things are delicious. So join me next time when we cook grits.